To continue our discussion on data types, we will take a look at the type function, which is used to find out the data type of an object, such as values held by variables. We will also look at the concept of type conversion, and we'll see how we can achieve explicit type conversion in Python. Sometimes in your code you might want to check the data type of a value held by a variable. And one convenient way to do that in Python is by using the type function. So we have already seen that, or we have already created one variable which is called num of students. Let's say that this variable is given some value from a place that is outside your control. For example, the input of a user, or a file that is located somewhere in your hard disk, or some data that is coming through your network. And you want to do some operation that requires specifically an int. So how can you tell whether this actually contains an integer or not? The way to do that is by using the type function in Python. And the way you write the type function is basically typing the word type and then passing an argument, which is in this case the object that you want to check the type of. And an object can be a variable, it can be a class, it can be a value or a literal value, and so on. So if you run this in Python, this will give you the type of the content of the value or the type of the value inside this variable. So this is basically telling you that inside the variable num of students you have an int value. Similarly, if you say what is the type of golden ratio, we see that golden ratio is a float. And what is the type of line, or sorry, the variable name was single line, and the type of single line was a string. And last, what is the type of 5 more than 3, and the type of the variable 5 more than 3 is bool. Of course, you can use the type function with direct literals. So for example, what is the type of hello world? Well, we know that hello world is a string, but this is really not that useful. It's very rarely that you will do this in Python, because you as a programmer already know that, well, hello world, or the literal hello world, is actually a string. So this is not of much use. Most of the time we will use the type function when you are dealing with variables. For example, how would you basically check what is the type of num of students? So let's say that you know, you don't know what is inside it, and you just want to check whether it is actually an integer or not. So is num of students, so num of students and again we'll come to conditionals. We'll talk about conditionals later on in this course, but what I'm about to write is basically a condition. So what is this saying? Is saying, is the type of the value contained inside num of students is equivalent to an int. So is it an integer? And well, we know it is an integer, so the answer is true. That's how you can use the type function to tell the type of values contained inside variables. Typical programming tasks require processing multiple types of data. And as a programmer, you should always be aware of the type of data that your program is processing. This will allow you to know what operations you can perform. And Python provides two ways to convert data into types you expect to deal with. And these are explicit data type conversion and implicit data type conversion. Explicit data type conversion is done using something that looks like functions, and we'll talk about this next. And implicit type conversion is done automatically by Python for you. and we'll cover implicit data type conversion later. Explicit type conversion is done using functions that take one argument of one type and return an object or a value of another type. And the commonly used built-in functions for explicit type conversion is listed down below. Let's see how we can use these functions in Python. So explicit type conversion is done using functions, and the first function that we're going to look at is the str function, which basically converts an object into a string. So let's say that I have a variable a, and this variable contains just the number 2. So we know that a is an integer or an int. If you want to convert a into a string, you use the str function and you pass it the object that you want to convert. So for example, if I pass it a, I will get back 2, but this time, as you can see, it is with single quotations. So this means that now the value a, which was an int, so a which was before an integer, has been converted into a string. So if I assign, so let's say that I create a variable and I'll call the variable, call it b, and let's say b will hold the output of this function call. So I'll, this function call basically will take a value. So so there is a value going in and there is a value coming out. And the value going in is basically the number 2, but the value coming out from here is the string 2. So basically the b will contain a string instead of a number. So if you press enter, b now contains the string 2. And you can do this for other data types as well. So for example, what is the string representation of the variable or the value 2.71? And that is the string 2.71. What about the string representation of the literal true? And that's the string containing the string true. So basically whatever it takes, whatever objects it takes, it converts into a string. The next conversion function that we'll look at is the int function, which basically allow you to convert strings, floats, and booleans into integer representations. So let's say I have the string 2 and I want to convert it to an int. So we basically call the int function by passing it the string 2. And let's say I want the int representation of 3.14, and if the number is a float, basically the decimal part will be eliminated or will be removed, and it will just return the natural, or basically it will return the integer part of the number. So the integer of 3.14 is 3. You can also convert booleans into integers. For example, what is the integer representation of false? Now, false in most programming languages can be represented as a 0, and the opposite of that, so the integer representation of true, is 1. And the next one that we'll look at is the float function. So again, float can be used to convert a string or an integer or a boolean into a floating point number. So what is the float of the string 2.718? And that is the number of the 2.718. What about the floating point number representation? So what is the float of 2? And that is 2.0. So you might be wondering, well, isn't 2.0 is the same as 2? Not really, because in Python it stores these differently. So 2 is being stored in a different manner from 2.0. So 2.0 is basically a floating point number, and 2 is an integer. What is the floating point representation of true? So remember, the integer of true is 1, and for float, well, remember, float has a decimal point, so that is 1.0. You can also convert other objects into Boolean using the bool function. And in Python, there is a general rule that is any object which is not empty is converted into true. So for example, what is the Boolean representation of 0? Well, that is false, because the empty integer, or basically it's basically 0. So 0 does not have any kind of quantity. On the other side, any kind of negative value, for example, bool -1, is true. Similarly, with floats, so for example, bool 0.0 is false, and any other floating point number, so for example, bool 2.7 is also true. What is the Boolean of a string? And this string contains only a space. So again, this is not an empty string because it does contain something. So since it's not empty, it should be a true. The last function which can be used for explicit conversion is the round function. And the round function basically takes a float and gives you back, or it takes a number, an object which contains a number, and it gives you back the integer, or the nearest integer to the number that it takes. So for example, if I round 2.7, the nearest integer to 2.7 is 3, and if I want to round 15.4, the nearest integer to 15.4 is 15. So that's it for explicit type conversion. On one last note, the explicit type conversion sometimes in textbooks is called typecasting. So if you see the term typecasting in textbooks or in the references that we have provided you for this lecture, then this is basically means the same as explicit typecasting. In the next video, we will look at the input function, and we will see how these functions, the explicit conversion functions, are useful when working with data input in Python.